Hello. Let people get seated, then we'll start. Let's open up to 490 as our first song for the night. And we'll do what we do, have a couple songs, and Guy will have our opening prayer. So that's 490. And we'll do the first and third tonight. It is well with my soul. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul, it is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trumps shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul, It is well with my soul. All right, let's turn over to 852. It's one I don't think we've sung in a while, but it's one I like. 852. When the roll is called up yonder, and on this one again, we'll just do the first and third. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, when the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Let us labor for the Master from the dawn till setting sun. Let us talk of all his wondrous love and care. Then when all of life is over and our work on earth is done, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. All right, Brother Guy.
Pray with me. Our Father in heaven, we have so many things to be thankful for. We thank you for this beautiful day, Father. We thank you for all the flowers that are in bloom. we ask, Father, that you be with us tonight, and that the lesson that being brought to us enters our heart and makes us better soldiers that you'd like us to be. We ask, Father, that you be with our nation as it faces all the trials it is facing, Father. And we ask that you be with the world and the war that is going on, Father, and the people that are suffering over in that war. We ask, Father, that you be with those of this family that are not here, who have an illness like cancer, Father, or something that is hurting them, Father, that you lay a comforting hand on, Father. It is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Let's open up to Luke chapter 2. So we're going to spend our time. That's Luke chapter 2. We're continuing our study on the life and ministry of Jesus. And we're going to spend more time in Luke 2. Look at another section of this chapter that I think is important to study. In the first half of this chapter, we read about Jesus' presentation at the temple in Jerusalem. We looked in more detail at that last week, but as we reach verse 39 of this chapter, the text says, "When they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth." Now, not too much to understand about the text there, but what we do find is that after Jesus' presentation at the temple, the text says they'd done everything according to the law of the Lord. They go home. Mary and Joseph go home. They return to the region of Galilee, which is in the northern portion of Israel, and it's where we find the city of Nazareth, their hometown. But with that in mind, this does fall into that context of just after everything they had to do with the baby Jesus had been done, they go home. But it's that sets the stage for what Luke will record in verses 40 through 52 of this chapter, where we find some details about Jesus, but Luke is moving from the infancy of Jesus to the later childhood of Jesus. Now, what we're going to find in this section is that Luke uses childhood language in order to emphasize to his readers that what he records in verses 40 through 52 is what happened in Jesus' life when he was just a young child. No older than 12 is what we see. So it's this point about the childhood of Jesus that we're going to explore by looking at three characteristics of the child Jesus that Luke reveals in verses 40 through 52. And I think the point that comes forth about Jesus as a child here is that even as a child, he was very godly, godlike, in other words. So we'll see that in the first characteristic in verse 40 is that he grew and became strong as a child. In verses 41 through 49, we'll see that Jesus had great knowledge as a child. And finally, in verses 50 and 51, Luke reveals that Jesus submitted to his parents as a child. And those things are followed by a concluding / summarizing statement in verse 52, where Luke summarizes by giving a summarized list of Jesus' physical and spiritual growth during his childhood. And the application we'll take from these things is that we too must strive to be godly children of God, of our Heavenly Father. So with that in mind, we'll begin just by reading through the text, just get it into our heads, and then we'll look at the points. So again, we're in Luke 2, beginning in verse 40, where Luke records, "The child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning, after spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan, and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When they saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And he said to them, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand the statement which he had made to them, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them, and his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. So we're looking at the childhood of Jesus. Beginning in verse 40, he became strong as a child is the first point we're going to be looking at today. But Luke makes a very simple statement. He says, the child, Jesus, continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom. So there's 3 characteristics here. What does that tell us about Jesus? What does Luke mean when you read this text? Again, we're just looking at verse 40. Continue to learn. Okay, Guy, you had your hand up.
Well, to me, what's happening is he is already above any other child. He's already shown, that he is God.
Right. So,
And I think that he's trying to portray that this man is increasing massively in his godly wisdom.
okay. So there is a hint of the fact that Jesus continued to mature here. So first, Luke says that he continued to grow. This is just his general statement about his growth. It's could be physical, but also might include spiritual growth because of what Luke says next about Jesus, which is that he became strong. He grew in strength, but Luke does not specify what kind of strength. It's it could refer to mental or spiritual strength, but could also include the physical. And we'll see that later in Jesus' dealings with the Jerusalem teachers in the context, even as a child. And finally, Luke says that he was increasing in wisdom. Now, what does it mean to be increasing? Gaining. So he's gaining wisdom, meaning he's becoming more and more wise. Now, also, I think something else we should know here is that the phrase we read here could literally be translated as becoming full of wisdom. Now, what kind of wisdom are we talking about here as far as Jesus is concerned? Whose wisdom? God's. So Jesus is growing and growing in God's wisdom. Now, the word increasing, the reason this phrase could be translated as becoming full of wisdom is because the word increasing, it comes from the same word that we get the word fulfill, which, as you've heard me say before, it's a word that means to fill up or to bring something to completion. So the wisdom Luke has in mind here would, of course, be the wisdom that comes from God, but Jesus was gaining more and more of this wisdom as a child as he continued to grow. But Luke doesn't stop there. He also says that the child, Jesus, he's saying that the grace of God was upon him. Now, when we talk about the grace of God, what normally comes to our minds? Okay, forgiveness, Guy. Okay, he gifted. The word grace literally could most simply be put as gift. What's that, Matt? Favor is the idea there. Jesus had God's favor upon him. But what I also want us to think about is that when we think of grace, we usually tie it in with forgiveness, the forgiveness of our sins. But Jesus didn't need that. So, with all that in mind, the word grace here, it's not how we usually think about it. It's just, as Matt alluded to, it's just the idea that God's favor was upon Jesus, no connection with forgiveness of sin or anything of that sort in Jesus' case. So, the grace Jesus enjoyed was a different kind of grace than what we enjoy. It's both favor, but it's to a much higher degree because of Jesus' sinless nature. So questions or comments on verse 40? All right. So the point we should see from verse 40 concerning the child Jesus is that he grew and became strong. Even at a young age, the child Jesus experienced great growth, physical, mental, and spiritual, all of that combined. But the result of that growth is that Jesus enjoyed God's grace in a very unique way, different from the way we enjoy it. So that is what brings us into verses 41 through 49. The next point, the child Jesus had great knowledge. This point is introduced in verse 41 with another statement about what Jesus' parents did, and that's that they went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. This verse sets the stage for what Luke will go on to record from this point going through verse 49. In other words, it's setting for us a context. So Luke is simply telling us that on an annual basis, Jesus' parents traveled to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the feast of the Passover. But then it's in verse 42 where we get some more information. Luke tells us that when Jesus became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. So, building on what he said in verse 41, what Luke records here in verse 42, it carries with it the idea that when Jesus became 12 years old, his parents did what they always did. They traveled to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast, is how the text reads. Now, what is a custom? Something you do. We might say a habit. It's something you do, as has been said. So, they're doing what they customarily did, is the idea. But one thing we should also understand from this verse is that Jesus being 12 years of age, this is significant. Luke doesn't just put it in there and just say, oh, Lori, go ahead. Okay. That's a custom. Mm-hmm. Right, and that is part of the idea here because we do see that in the text that they did that every year. But yes, it's a custom, it's something you belong to, but this is the language that Luke is using. But again, the other point I was beginning to address is the fact that Luke tells us Jesus was 12 years old. He doesn't put that in there by accident. There's some significance to this. At 12 years of age, Jewish boys, like Jesus in this case, they were preparing to become a part of the religious community. That's where we get the term, you've probably heard it, bar mitzvah. Have you heard that before? That phrase literally means son of the law. That Jewish celebration that is a bar mitzvah took place at 12, 13 years of age. It's at that point that Jewish boys would become more obligated to carry out the Jewish law in their lives. At 13 years old. That's kind of foreign to our minds because of what 13-year-olds are like today. But that's why Luke puts this information in there for us. At that time, when Jesus was preparing to become a part of the religious community that was the Jews. But he also uses this language according to the custom of the feast, like we were just discussing. That's just a way of saying that the parents were doing what the Jewish law prescribed concerning the Passover. Part of which was to offer sacrifices to God, which at this time was something that would be done in the temple at Jerusalem. Questions or comments on verse 42? Right. Yeah, it's the Oxford definition. This guy. Yeah. Anything else on verse 42? Lori? Possibly. That's true. It seems to be at this point in his life where he's really reaching that awareness, and we'll see that later in the context of what he needed to be doing. And we'll touch on that a little bit later in the context. Anything else on verse 42? Okay. So verse 43, the story continues. When Jesus' parents were returning after spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it. What's the situation according to this verse? Okay, we'll see that later in the verse in the section. Guy, you had your hand up.
Well, he was in a place that they had no idea that he was there.
Okay, so yeah, we'll see that here in the verses. But yes, the situation is that they're going back home after spending the full number of days, and then Jesus stays behind. Guy, go ahead.
See, I'm looking at this as, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, because I think there's some miraculous things going on here in my mind, because parents usually know where their kids are at. I think it was positioned through God that they didn't know.
Okay, well, we'll touch on that here in just verse 44, but hold that thought. But here in verse 43, Luke is just presenting to us the situation. They've stayed for the whole entirety of the Passover. They're going home. Jesus stays behind, but the parents are not aware of it. That's going to set the stage for what Guy is taking us toward. But this full number of days that Luke is referring to here would be a total of 7 days. They were in Jerusalem for a total of 7 days. That's what the Jewish law prescribed. The feast of the Passover would have taken place over a 7-day period. Jews would have been eating unleavened bread and offering sacrifices, among other things. But the point Luke is making here is that the Passover was over, Jesus' parents are going home, and Jesus stays behind without his parents knowing it. So it's in verse 44 where we see what they do about it. Now, what's their assumption in verse 44? What's that, Matt? That's what they assume. So the friends, the relatives and acquaintances, another word for friends. So this is what they assume. Now, part of what this tells us is that when Mary and Joseph and Jesus go to the Passover, they didn't go by themselves. It was normal for people to travel in large groups because we have this word caravan here. It's a group. So they don't see Jesus. They think, okay, well, he might be with one of our family members or friends here. And they think that for a day. They go a day's journey is what the text tells us. So they've traveled a day, and during that day period, they assume Jesus is with their friends or family. Questions or comments on verse 44? Okay. So with that being true, they are searching for Jesus at this point. Then verse 45 comes. They did not find him. So what do? They return to Jerusalem to look for him. Now, yes, going back to Guy's comment, God is involved in all of this, but Luke does not directly address that. He's just telling us what's going on. They're returning home. Jesus stayed behind. Parents don't know about it. They search for him among the friends and relatives. They don't find him. Verse 45, they come back to Jerusalem in order to continue their search for Jesus. Now, we have to remember here at this point, they're a day outside of Jerusalem. So it's going to take a day to get back. So I want us to keep that in mind as we move through this section. So continue with that point about the search for Jesus. In verse 46, Luke records that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. So continuing with the thought of verse 45, this has the sense in verse 46 that after searching for Jesus for 3 days in Jerusalem, they were able to find him in the temple, doing what Luke describes here with the teachers. Now, I mentioned the days here. I touched on that in verse 45. Now, I bring that up because this 3 days that Luke mentions here, it seems to be a reference to the total time that they were looking for Jesus. Day 1, friends and relatives. Day 2, the time it takes to get back to Jerusalem. They find him on day 3 in the temple. Does that make sense? Okay. So, they find Jesus doing in the temple what is described here. What is he doing when they find him in the temple? Listening and asking questions. He's talking to these Jewish teachers. This was normal. Much similarly, not much, but similarly, like we're doing right now, there's discussion going on. That was normal Jewish setting. It was the Jewish Bible class, we might say. There'd be listening, asking questions from both sides, answers going on. They find Jesus doing what was normally going on in the temple at that time. So Jesus is listening to the teachers. He's asking them questions about what's being taught, and that's what they find Jesus doing. Questions or comments on verse 46? All right. So verse 47. The people are hearing Jesus doing what he's doing, and what's their response? Is that the word you have there, astonished? Okay. Yeah, they're astonished. The New American Standard has the word amazed, but that is the idea. Why would they be so astonished? He's a kid. He knew a lot for his age. So this is where we're beginning to see that Jesus, even as a child, he had great knowledge. So they're amazed, first of all, at his understanding of what's being taught and his answers to the questions that are being asked. So this is where we see that part of the student-teacher relationship at this time is that both the teacher and the student would be asking each other questions, and the purpose of that was to promote the learning that was occurring at this time. Guy, go ahead.
See, I'm sitting here looking at this and saying, okay, did Jesus get all of his knowledge straight from God, or did he have to learn that? Like it says here in these verses, and I'm thinking he had an ability to learn it in a godlike manner, but he still had to learn it.
Yeah, just based on some of the language that Luke uses, it's very likely that there had to be some learning going on. In other words, that he wasn't necessarily automatically endowed with all this knowledge. Because he's going through that's something we have to remember about Jesus. I'm going off on a tangent here, but we'll come back. That's something personally that I think we need to remember about Jesus. Jesus came in the flesh. No argument there. But in doing so, God's side of things, God through Jesus, he's going through the entire human experience. The Hebrews writer says he was tempted in all things, but was without sin. So Jesus is going through the entire human experience. He never sins. So tying that in with this, there was probably some degree of learning, normal human learning that he had to do. One evidence we have for that, one reason we might be able to assume that is because at the beginning of this, Luke said he was increasing in wisdom. He was growing in that wisdom, which implies learning. Questions or comments on any of that before we keep moving forward? That's probably true. No. Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. You didn't come out doing everything a human does right off the bat. Um, so good points. Anything else on verse 47? All right. Well, let's go to verse 48. Luke turns his attention to Mary. Mary and Joseph see him. The response is the same. They're astonished. And what does Mary say? Why have you done this to us? What is she talking about? What has Jesus done in her mind? Wasn't where he was supposed to be. Why'd you do it, Jesus? Your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. So they're worried. It's completely natural. Your child's nowhere to be found. You get worried. All of us know that feeling. That would be a great degree of anxiety. So, yeah, imagine that those thoughts would run through your mind. I lost the Son of God. So I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good point. What's that? That's true. All those thoughts would run through your mind. So Luke tells us that Mary is astonished. So we have to ask, the astonishment could be similar to what was being said about him with his understanding and answers, but tying in might also be the astonishment that Jesus made this decision in the first place to stay behind and make his parents worry. We can't know for certain, but whatever the case, what Luke wants his readers to know here about Mary is how she responded to Jesus with this question. Sandy? Possibly. Her question indicates great degree of concern. She could have been very frustrated, and there's just no way to tell. But the right, right. Yeah, it was probably more accidental. It could be any number of scenarios there. Anything else on verse 48? We'll go to verse 49. Okay. So how does Jesus respond in verse 49? What does he say? Why did you seek me? And what else does he ask? Is that how yours reads? Had to be about my father's business? Okay. Mine says, did you not know that I had to be in my father's house? Guy?
Well, when I read this part of it, here's where I say that he separated himself as he's kind of in a way saying, don't worry about me. He's claiming in a way independence in a way.
Right.
But he's also saying, I'm on God's work now, is what he's saying.
Right, and that's definitely on point. And that's important to note because Jesus isn't being disrespectful here. This carries with the idea that Jesus wanted to know why they were looking for him, and it's part of it is they should have known where to find him. But he's being very respectful in what he says. Okay. Well, we might be tempted to look at it that way, but because of the second question that he asked here, indicates that at this point in his life, he's really becoming aware of what God expects of him. His dad is not Joseph. His father is God. But one reason we know he's not being disrespectful is because of what he does after this in verses 50 and 51. It is tempting to look at it that way. It's like, why would Jesus answer this way? Well, he has a legitimate reason too. He's becoming aware of his responsibility toward God the Father. Right. Yeah, we don't know for sure. Exactly. And again, as a Jewish boy at 12 reaching the age of 13, that obligation would be there, whether you're the son of God or not. So he's having to strike a balance between his responsibility to God and his responsibility toward his earthly parents. And Jesus would be well aware that the Ten Commandments say, honor your father and mother. He'd do that because it's part of his sinlessness. Guy, go ahead.
And his parents are well aware of what he is.
Exactly. They know he's the Son of God more than anybody else. Anything else on verse 49? Okay. So putting verses 41 through 49 together, the point we should see from these verses about the child Jesus is that he had great knowledge. Luke has shown that even at the age of 12, Jesus exhibited a knowledge that was far greater than anyone else his age. And that's evidenced in the fact that he had great understanding and was able to provide answers to the questions of the teachers that caused him, them, and others to be amazed. And since Jesus had these qualities about him, that is what prompted him to stay behind in Jerusalem as part of his responsibility toward God the Father. So that brings us into verses 50 and 51. The last characteristic we see of Jesus before the summarizing statement, and that's that he's submitted to his parents. Now, beginning in verse 50, Luke gives us some more insight as to Mary's response to what he had said. What's her response to what he had said? What does Luke tell us in verse 50? She did not understand the statement which he had made to them, the text says. So what does that mean? What did she not understand? Okay? Right. Exactly. That's what she didn't understand. She didn't have a full comprehension of his responsibility toward God the Father. Jesus has made that statement, depending on what translation you have, I have to be about my Father's business, or I had to be in my Father's house. I have to do what God wants me to do, is the idea. So that's what she didn't understand, the magnitude of the responsibility that he had, being not the son of Joseph, but the Son of God. So, having recorded that, in verse 51, Luke records that after these things, Jesus went down to with his earthly parents to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them, and his mother treasured all these things in her heart. So what does it mean that he continued in subjection to them? He obeyed them. As a child, he continued to live in obedience to his parents. Well, how's Mary feeling? What's she thinking about everything that's happened? Right. All right. It's at this point, the text says his mother treasured all these things in her heart. It's at this point where she's beginning to realize this son of hers is no ordinary son. There's something to him. And she'll continue to see this as he grows up, because Mary's still involved in his life all throughout his ministry. And we see that clear to the cross. But it says his mother treasured all these things in her heart. What does it mean to treasure something? Okay, it's sacred, you keep it safe, and somebody said something over here. Has value to it. So she's seeing the value in her son. She's pondering these things. She's seeing how precious her son really is. Up to and including in the fact that even though he's the Son of God, he still obeyed Mary and Joseph. So it's all those things. Everything Luke has described up to this point is what Mary is treasuring. Not just what happened in Jerusalem, but everything else that's happened with Jesus up to this point. But the point Luke is making in verses 50 and 51 is about the characteristics of Jesus are concerned, is that he submitted to his parents. Jesus continued in obedience to his earthly parents while still maintaining his obedience to God the Father. He willingly returned with them to Nazareth after the Jerusalem incident. He knew they were worried about him, and so he goes with them back. Eases their concern, we might say. So that brings us into verse 52, which again, as I mentioned, is a summarizing statement. It says, Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. And that statement, what is Luke telling us about Jesus? Right. Right. He's maturing. Exactly. Exactly. So it's going back to the original statement at the beginning of this section. He's continuing to mature. Wisdom deals with the wisdom from God and that knowledge. Stature, as Dina said, it's his size, his physical growth. And then his relationship with God and people. He had a good relationship with everybody at this point in his life. So, questions or comments on verse 52? Oh, we get some idea of his relationship with his siblings just through isolated verses. But yeah, anything else on verse 52? Mm-hmm. That's recorded in John chapter 2. Well, Jesus, it's been a while since I've looked at that text because I'm so far into John, but Mary basically told Jesus, you have to do this. But Jesus' response, my hour has not yet come. So at that point, Mary knew that Jesus had some abilities, so she was probably pleased at that first miracle that we have recorded for us anyway. So, does that answer your question? It probably did reinforce it. So, yeah. Anything else on verse 52? Okay. So, when we consider everything that we've examined from this section on the childhood of Jesus, what we should see is that he was a godly child. Even as a child, he was godlike. This is seen in that he grew and became strong. He had great knowledge, and that he submitted to his parents. So, the application of that to us is that we too must seek to be godly children of God. Now, no secret, we've already said it, Jesus is the Son of God. That goes without saying, but we also find scriptures that teach that when we come into that relationship with God, we too are sons and daughters of God. As a result of these things, we have to emulate the example of Jesus that is seen even in his childhood. Continue to spiritually grow and become stronger. Grow in our knowledge of God and of Jesus, and submit to our Heavenly Father, God. If we do that, we, like the child Jesus, will become more godly children of God. Anything else on what we've examined today? All right. Dean, will you close us out?